Hi girls, and welcome to this lesson, which follows directly on from the one we did together on Zoom earlier in the week. So earlier in the week we started looking at the Philippines as being a multi-hazard environment, and in particular we looked at why it's particularly vulnerable, or the people that live there are particularly vulnerable from hazards, and I'll recap that in a moment. What we're going to be looking at today is looking at in a little bit more detail about what the hazards are and using examples from the past, so examples of those hazards from the past and what happened in them, so that to show severity, so that when we're talking about the threats the Philippines face, we can give examples that show sort of how serious those threats are. And using examples is definitely one of, if not the best way, most effective way to do that. Okay, so just before I start doing that, a quick summary from last time. So when we were talking about vulnerability, I highlighted a couple of areas, and you can see those displayed on the screen here, of why the Philippines, or the people of the Philippines, are sort of so vulnerable. So from the top, the tectonic situation, you'll remember that we saw how it's on the Pacific Ring of Fire, and that the fault line sort of runs right down where the Philippines is, so right down sort of east coast. And that fault line is a destructive plate margin, which gives us explosive volcanoes, powerful earthquakes. Also, we know that that fault line in particular on the Pacific Ring of Fire is one of the most active fault lines in the world. So the plates are moving relatively quickly, for as quick as plates ever move. So the regularity of those events is greater in this part of the world too. On top of that, tsunami is a real threat because of the nature of it being an island, and the fault line is just off the coast and it's destructive. They are the ingredients, if you like, that can lead to tsunami waves. So you've got the threat of powerful earthquakes, plus that sort of related secondary threat of tsunami, which we know how devastating that can be from examples we've seen. We've also got volcanoes, and the type of volcanoes that can be very explosive due to that viscous magma. We then looked at the tropical storm vulnerability. So the Philippines is in the tropics, which we know from our work on storms is where they occur. Also, when we did work on storms and we looked at sort of the maps of where they occur, again, you know, the Philippines is in the path of both very powerful storms, or typhoons as we call them in this part of the world, but also that it's one of the parts of the world where they happen most regularly. So again, that level of threat and risk is higher. I then spoke briefly about the physical geography of the Philippines. So the fact that it's an archipelago, it's a collection of many islands, makes it much harder maybe to respond to disasters, because obviously it's transport and logistics is more difficult. Also the fact that many people will, by virtue of the fact there's lots of islands, live by the coast. So there'll be more threat from storm surges and flooding, tsunami waves and so on. The other thing is that people are more likely to live by the coast because sort of the central areas are quite mountainous, which makes it hard to settle on. The other thing is, you know, the population to some extent will be near some of these great big volcanoes we've mentioned. So there's reasons why the physical geography further enhances those risks. Socioeconomic background, I didn't give you a great deal of information on, but sort of introduced this idea that you should have a look at things like, what is the population size? Obviously, if it's a large population, well, the hazard is naturally greater, because a hazard is about the threat to people. If there's more people when an earthquake happens, or an eruption or anything, well then the size of the hazard is greater because there's more people at risk. And of course it also makes it harder to deal with. Other things we would consider here is the level of economic development, the level of wealth, things like the quality of healthcare, because as we know, the ability of a country to respond and deal with these issues is affected largely by how wealthy it is, and therefore you know, the sort of things it can put in place to protect against these events. And finally, and it does talk about this if you read the whole case study, the fact it's a multi-hazard environment can mean that actually the overall sort of size of the hazard for them, if you like, is more than the sum of its parts. So, in other words, because maybe they're dealing with, well, first off, it's harder to prepare for lots of different types of hazard because they might need slightly different preparations, and therefore you're spreading your resources more thinly. But also this, you know, that it's never going to have been that long ago that there was quite a large hazard having taken place. So when you're getting over one and trying to maybe rebuild for next time, maybe trying to increase your resilience for next time, you then get hit by another hazard. So that makes it all the more harder. And of course that also feeds back into socio-economic development. You know, it takes a significant part of their GDP to respond to these disasters and to prepare for them. So that can sort of enhance a sort of cycle of poverty, if you like, and then that feeds back into, and that makes it therefore harder to prepare for hazards. So to summarise from last time, there's lots of very clear reasons, or categories of reasons, why the Philippines we would look at as being particularly vulnerable to hazards. Okay, so what I want to focus on today is about the sort of severity of these hazards if we do look at them individually. So to learn about some of the past natural hazards that have occurred, so what types of earthquakes have happened there in the past, volcanic eruptions, typhoons. To consider and record the key information that will help you illustrate the level of hazard in the Philippines. So to think, well, you know, be a bit selective. What information do I need that's going to, you know, help me make this point? And then to practice using this in an answer. Okay, so how I want you to do that is, first off, sort of through the use of a bit of a table, and you can see I've put the real skeleton of a table on the board here to show you what I mean. So, first column, the hazard type. Well, that's it. There's only those three things really we're going to put in there. They're the three things we want to look at in detail: earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and typhoons. We then need some examples of those. Now, the examples that I've got on the board here are lifted straight out of the textbook on page 222. Whilst I'm not saying that that's enough on its own, it's an obvious starting place that you would look in the book first, and then once you've got what's readily available in the textbook without too much hard work, then you might think, well, okay, I'm going to add a typhoon. So you know, at the moment I've only got one typhoon. If there's none others in the case study, you might think, well, I'm going to try and find out another example of a typhoon that affected the Philippines. The final column is the most important one, and that's where we're going to select some details that illustrate how serious things are, how difficult it was to deal with. I've given just one example here. Again, this example, you'll see I've lifted it straight out of the textbook. So it relates to the 1976 earthquake, which took place just off the coast of the Philippines, and it caused tsunami waves, and it was estimated that about 8,000 people died as a result of those. That's a very simple little bit of information, but you see how I could use that later on in an answer to illustrate the seriousness of the threats. The other thing that's quite nice about that example is I could also use that to illustrate how there's secondary effects, and they can cause big problems. Now, when you look in a textbook, to be honest, so for example on that one, on that particular earthquake, it doesn't really tell you much more about it. So I think it would be good to do a quick bit of internet research, 1976 Morro Gulf earthquake, and maybe try and find out a little bit more. How many people were injured? how many people had to flee their homes? Is there a cost of the damage? So, you know, just some of these sort of, I would call them almost headline sort of statistics, but that are very effective in helping us show the severity. And then do the same for Luzon and Bohol there. I think probably 3 examples of earthquakes is enough. I don't think we need thousands and thousands of examples, but it's up to you if you want to look to see if there's been any more recent ones. Same with the volcanic eruption. So actually what I've got listed there are just the volcanoes, because I suppose, you know, the volcanoes are still there. They will be a threat in the future, but you could maybe look at the most recent large-scale eruption as a way of showing how severe that could be. So I often mention Pinatubo and how big the eruption was and things. Again, there's a little bit of information in the textbook that can help you with that 3rd column, but you might want to then just, again, a little bit of internet research to do that. On Typhoon Haiyan, there's not much in the multi-hazard case study, but the reason for that, of course, is because you've done a case study on that separately. So that should be quite easy to put a few headline details in and a bit of revision of that. And as I said, I think it'd be good to maybe add a typhoon to that so you've got more than just one example. So that's the first task for you to do, to you know, complete your own sort of table. I mean, whether you decide to actually do it as a table or not is up to you, but that works quite well for things like this, and you can then sort of extract the information you need. The task that I'm going to want you to actually hand in, I've made it a 9-mark question. That's really just to give you an idea of how much to write. So the equivalent, if you were writing it by hand, of about a side. I'm not quite sure what that is on as a word count for using a word processor, but that, you know, it's a 9-mark question to give you a feel for sort of how much I want you to write. So I put, outline the nature of the hazards that are faced by the Philippines. Use examples to illustrate your answer. Really what you're doing here, and I'd have if I'd done my table, I'd have that in front of me when I do this, is you're really making an answer sort of out of the information that's on there. But of course, you know, it shouldn't read like a list. So again, you might be thinking about, so there's not a huge amount from last lesson in this answer, although that might help you be a bit more evaluative. So you might start off, for example, saying how the Philippines is a multi-hazard environment which causes sort of problems, and the main hazards it experiences are this, this and this. And then you might say all of these on their own can be severe, and then you might go through them sort of one at a time, briefly reflect on some of the past instances, give some details from your table, so that we start getting a real clear picture and a real clear feeling of just how serious, you know, this situation is, and it can be, the sort of the potential of these hazards. And then maybe you just finish off by coming back to the fact that, you know, the fact that the Philippines faces all of these hazards, and they could happen in quick succession, or even potentially at the same time, or that you might be getting over one when the next one strikes, sort of amplifies the overall hazard. Okay, so hopefully that's enough guidance that you've got a clear idea of what it is you need to do. I will put a place on Satchel for you to hand this in online. Word processor is best for me, to be honest. It's easiest to read. If that is a real problem for you, or you're struggling to get access to a computer, etc., you can write it by hand and take a photo of it and upload that. It's my second choice just because it's harder for me to read, and I think when you type the answer out, it's much easier for me to read it and give you a little bit of feedback and mark it, etc. But the option's there if that's a real problem for you. I know with everyone locked down and working from home, these things can be difficult. Okay, so hope you get on all right with that. Let me know if you have any problems. Thanks very much.